Hi, my name is Lauren Centrella, and I'm the Interim Chief Development Officer here at WAMU. As a public media organization, our mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and the world. Public radio works because listeners and members who value the service step up and give back. Support from listeners and members is also our most reliable and important source of funding, especially right now. This book club would not be possible if we did not have your support. Whether this is your first book club or your 10th, if you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift to support this series of events. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. We are grateful for the over 1,300 people who registered to join us today. I want to let you know that this event is being recorded and closed captioning is available. Just click the CC button on your screen. And now let's start the discussion with the host of our book club, Diane.
Thank you, Lauren, and welcome to all of you to the August meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Today we discuss Horse by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Geraldine Brooks. The novel uses the true story of a champion 19th century racehorse to connect characters through time and place. Kentucky in 1850, New York City in 1954, and Washington, D.C. in 2019. In the end, the strands combine to tell a sweeping tale about passion and injustice across American history. Joining me today are Dana Williams, Professor of African American Literature and Dean of the Graduate School at Howard University. Gal Beckerman is Senior Editor for Books at The Atlantic and author of The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas. And Katherine Mooney, Associate Professor of History at Florida State University and author of Race, Horse, Men, How Slavery and Freedom Were Made at the Racetrack. We are going to take your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Welcome to all of you. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Good to see you too.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a pleasure.
Thank you. Gal, let's start with you. There are 3 segments in this book in terms of the history. We start in Kentucky in 1850, then go to New York City in 1954, and finally to Washington, D.C. in 2019. Talk about how those different segments connect and create the narrative.
Well, first of all, I should say I sort of love books that do this. I think the last time we talked, Diane, was over Cloud Cuckoo Land, Anthony Doerr's book, and it had a similar dynamic where, present was connected to the past, and it was largely physical objects that were doing the connecting. Here, that's the case too. So, in our story that in the mid-19th century, we're introduced to a horse who will eventually be called Lexington, who is one of the most famous horses of the time period. But it's Lexington's bones, Lexington's remains that make it to Washington in the present day. And that's sort of what connects those two parts of the book. There's also a beautiful painting, an equestrian painting of the horse, which also travels through time. So you have these stories that are sort of self-contained within the period of time, but also feel like they are a part of one another, because you have these material objects that exist in all three. So that is, and I think there's a lot of pleasure for the reader in that too, because you're sort of trying to see how they connect and how these objects are going to sort of move from one section to another. So for example, we learn when we just have the skeleton of the horse, we learn that there is some kind of damage to the horse's eye, but we haven't learned that yet in the 19th century part.
Right.
So we're waiting to see sort of how that develops in that section of the book. So it's a very sort of smart way of keeping the narrative moving, but also making you feel this kind of connective tissue between the past and the present.
I agree. And Katherine, the heart of the book, as Gal was saying, is this magnificent horse, originally named something else, but finally known as Lexington. Tell me about the real Lexington and the role that horse running and playing played in the 1850s.
So I would agree that Lexington was the most famous horse of that period, but I think you can also say he's one of the most famous American thoroughbreds and international thoroughbreds of all time. So if you go back, for instance, in the pedigrees of Kentucky Derby winners, I believe the last time I saw it checked, dozens of them trace back to him. I mean, the modern American thoroughbred is impossible without him. And he really is sort of a modern day celebrity in the way that we understand sports celebrity, and that was just then being invented. So I think we have this sort of emotional reaction to the creature in the book because we associate horses with romance and and the past, and I think that's evoked. But I think there's also this very 1850s sort of modern celebrity fascination, and fascination that sort of would have bled over to the people who worked with the horse in a way that's also kind of evoked.
And Dana, there's this strong connection in the 1850s between horse breeding and raising and slavery. Talk about that, if you would.
I think what we see Brooks try to do here is to give voice, especially to those people who had been otherwise silenced. So we know in reality, they were critical to the success or the limitations of a horse. And so much of that labor was done by enslaved people, or someone who had been enslaved and perhaps was able to buy freedom because of the work that they were able to do with the horse. And in rare instances, because the owner of the horse, who I think Brooks also does a really good job of making clear, still sees the groomsmen or the people who help to care for the horse or even the jockey as their property, as we see in this book, where Jarret is often referred to in the title based on who he belongs to as opposed to by his father's last name. I don't think we can separate horse racing in the late to mid 1800s, or actually 1800s, before the Civil War and after, without really thinking about what enslavement makes possible for the leisure class to even be able to come to watch these races, let alone to be able to bet on them, and then to sustain cultures that make it possible for horse racing to become a sport.
It was interesting that Geraldine portrays the thousands of people who come out to watch these races, and those were both Black and white. It was an exciting moment to see these races and to put in $1 into the barrel to gain admission. So it had to have been popular among the entire population. Dana, would you agree?
I think so. And I think there's a distinction to be made, though, between the enslaved and the people who had some modicum of freedom, because I'm cautious even to say free completely, because at any moment, and the book makes this clear, they could have been taken by slave catchers somewhere else just by virtue of the color of their skin. But I think the people who were there, who were spectators, were by and large people who had the luxury, again, of being able to watch the sport, who had earned some keep for themselves to be able to pay the entrance fee. And then it also had the benefit of almost a sedative for the horrors of slavery in the South. So if you allowed your enslaved people to come to watch this as sport, it was something of a relief, because certainly immediately thereafter, you would go back to these plantation labor camps, right? To then have labor extracted from you with a certain level of pride that had every paradox that you can imagine, because you want your quote unquote master's person to be, or horse to be the one to win, so, because you wanted to be able to identify with some level of victory. And I think the really interesting part about the North versus the South in the moments leading up to the civil rights movement, and whether or not a horse's master was for the union cause or against the union cause as this point of conflict, I think just makes that all the more clear.
There was so much cheating involved here, Goal, in that Gerald's father was a free man. He had purchased his own freedom. And the master of that household had promised to his father that the horse would be his and the earnings would be his, which he could divide. But then he reneges on that promise altogether. I mean, it's as though you can trust no one in this business.
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly if you're Black or if you're formerly enslaved, it seems to just. I mean, this is the point I think that Dana was making, that the precariousness of the situation, even of those people who did manage to purchase their freedom. I think one of the interesting elements for me here is sort of at the same time, Brooks is showing us these slight, gradations in power, even within the slavery system. That somebody like Jarret or his father has this ability to. They have a skill that makes them useful, that allows them to that gives them some leverage, let's say, but. At the same time, at the end of the day, they're still seen uniformly. We have that moment where Jarret is sent to another plantation and then goes and works in the fields. And it is. I think what Brooks is trying to do is both bring in some. I think she's trying to bring in some texture into our understanding of slavery and into the way that she's portraying it. And Jarret is kind of has this interesting vantage point. It reminded me of moments of the movie 12 Years a Slave, where you have a man who's coming as an outsider and suddenly finds himself at the center of, who did not grow up in slavery, who grew up free and suddenly finds himself in that system. And so he's viewing it. He's both inside of it and he's a little bit outside of it. And so I think Jarret becomes a fascinating character for that reason.
Do you agree, Katherine?
I think that's very true. And I think, if we take that to the 21st century part of the book, I think Theo is sort of the sort of natural analog there, where she's doing something where she's really trying to experiment with the idea. I think that you can experience racism, but not everybody experiences racism or the structures of enslavement or racial oppression the same way. And that gives people different perspectives on it. But I think there's a really interesting thing going on here where I think there's this question of how much of an outsider are you? And how much is she successful in evoking what people would have understood, even if their experience was different from those of the people immediately around them? So there are moments in the 19th century portion of it where I think the relationship between father and son is really beautifully evoked. And the way they talk to each other about love is really very understated. And they're mostly talking about the work, because the work is this thing that they share and they love, these animals that they both, really, really have this tie to emotionally, but they also clearly love each other so deeply. And that really left me thinking about what would Harry Lewis have said to his son about what enslavement was, because there's several moments here where he seems to me almost, I don't know what the right adverb is, but certainly naive. And I thought, maybe your father wouldn't have said much to you, but I think he would have said more than her version of Harry Lewis seems to have said.
What do you think about that, Dana?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, because at one point, Harry is clear that he has not prepared him well enough. I mean, he knows very aggressively what his role is and what Theo's role is. And at the point where Theo confronts him and says, Mary has told me that this is what's going to happen, we're clear that Harry has a clue that this is going to happen. And he actually tells Theo, listen, as far as I'm concerned, there isn't anything that I can do about it. And he shrinks in Theo's eyes in some ways, but one thing that Harry says that rings true for me is he says something like, I clearly haven't prepared you, or I clearly haven't helped you to understand completely what this is. For me, I appreciated it as something that rang authentic, because there's no reason to believe that his father would not have tried to protect him from that. Under every circumstance, the kind of myth that there is this detachment out of fear that the person will be taken from you, or that mothers are reserved about loving their children, or fathers have these kind of limitations, I think is just that. It's like precisely a myth. What Harry is trying to do is to allow Theo to be a full human on his own terms. And only when this has to be interrupted does he have to say, all right, here's part of your reality. I don't know whether or not, for me, it did indeed ring true, just because I could believe completely. Of course, he tried to shield him from this horror until he knows that he can't protect him any longer.
And yet, in the end, Jarret himself says that he grew as a human being, understanding what slavery had done to so many people. In other words, to be down on his knees, to see the fields of slaves picking and doing what their masters demanded. Somehow Jarret grew from that in his own mind, because he had been so protected. You don't agree, Dana?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that I juxtaposed Jarret and Theo, but I agree. So with my earlier comment, but I think we all knew that I meant Jarret. And I mean, that's really interesting that I see this like direct line in terms of slavery's unfinished business. But I agree with that point in part because what Harry has to be clear about is whether or not Jarret can adjust at the moment that he has to adjust.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to restrain him and all of his exuberance, but what he has to be absolutely clear about is whether or not Jarret will know when to draw the line. And Jarret shows us that he absolutely does. He's had no experience with plantation slavery. He gets to the South, and when he is under the purview of this overseer and he realizes, oh my goodness, I don't have the kind of freedom that I thought I had. It takes a minute, it takes a beating, it takes some bleeding, but he makes the adjustment. And that, I think, is what his father knew that he had the ability to do, to make the turn when necessary. So seeing that, I don't think he had to restrain him.
Here is a question from Jenny, who says, I read about 1/3 of the book, then started reading only the 1850 chapters. I returned to where I left off and then read the other chapters. How effective do you feel Brooks' arrangement of chapters works? That style seems quite popular, but obviously, she says, it did not work too well for her. What do you think about that, Gal?
I mean, I think that the style and sort of that approach of sort of intercutting characters' perspectives, it is a way to sort of keep readers engaged. I think that from a purely technical,
And they were short chapters.
they're short chapters. It's a very popular mode now, but in some ways, I mean, it goes back to the birth of sort of modernism, this notion of kind of going, moving from one character to another, and this Rashomon, like, seeing the same scene from different perspectives. Here she's doing it historically, of course, but, I think there is another question embedded in hers, which is how connected or how realistic or how the level of verisimilitude that we can sort of pull out as a reader when it comes to the 19th century characters versus the contemporary ones, especially when she's writing into a Black experience, and so one is a little bit more limited reading the 19th century because she doesn't have sources for what, or many sources at least for what enslaved people were thinking at the time. She doesn't have a diary that somebody like a Jarret left behind. So there's a lot more sort of invention on her part in terms of creating that character. And we have a distance as contemporaries, from that experience. So she can write, she can put all kinds of thoughts in his head and we don't have anything to compare it to. I think it gets a little bit harder in the contemporary section because Theo is somebody that we would know, and his experience in contemporary America is one that many other Black Americans compare themselves to, so I think that she has a harder task there. And, I'm curious what others think, but to me, there was sort of a strange jaggedness to kind of her abilities as a writer, focus on those sections versus the more contemporary ones.
What did you think about the relationship between Theo and Jess in the 20th century and how that began to develop? At first, they're both at the Smithsonian or one of the art galleries, and Jess, this young woman from Australia, believes that Theo, who has a bike identical to that of Jess's, she thinks he's a Black man about to steal her bike. And she walks up to him and confronts him, and he looks over and sees that her bike is identical to his. That's quite a meeting and a clear designation of how so many people in the United States, even today, think, oh my, that man must be about to steal my bike. Katherine, would you agree?
Well, one of the things that really strikes me about that scene, and indeed about, I guess, the whole thing, is that Brooks is creating these really individual characters, And in fact, as we were just discussing, right, people who are in some ways feel themselves to be outsiders. But in doing that, she's, I think, also in some ways trying to tell a story about, as Dana was saying earlier, that enslavement continues to have these ramifying legacies, and that to some degree that touches everyone, and that she, in doing that, sort of is trying to create these little vignettes that tell something that she thinks of as, emblematic of the history of enslavement and racial oppression in America. So, I mean, to me, you can actually draw a line from the cotton field, right, which, is, I think, the way so many people immediately viscerally understand what slavery is. And so if she wants to tell this sort of, in some ways, universal, epic scale story, she has to have that in there, to the moment, right, of racial profiling. And then even to the very end of the book, which I know we're a little concerned about spoilers, but
Yeah.
that there is this effort to create this sort of, I don't want to say universal, but sort of epic scale narrative about
And
this
it-
big thing through individuals.
And in fact, Dana, Theo is a graduate student at Georgetown University. His parents were diplomats. He was raised in fairly well-to-do circumstances, and he's an art history major, whereas Jess is fascinated with bones and works at the Smithsonian, where in fact the skeleton of Lexington is deeply buried in storage and has been put away for years and years. The idea that the two intersect, she a young woman from Australia, white, he a black man from England, and a soccer star, actually polo, not soccer, that they come together. What did you think about their joining together, Dana?
I thought, as literary technique, it served a couple of purposes. Having Theo be an American immigrant of African descent allowed her to tell the story of how difficult it is to really understand the absurdity of American racism. So even as he understands his Black skin, he doesn't understand its implications completely, that he has to give himself self-talk in terms of, like, when he's running, how he should behave, how far away from the door he should stand, and the tension of not knowing when to draw the line. So there's this point when he likes the young lady and his friend tells him, well, you weren't really Black enough for her. I think it allows Brooks to tell the story about the wide ranges of Blackness. It also allows her to talk about the sensitivities with which he is imbued. So he's kind enough that even though he knows that he can make $15,000 from a painting, he gives it back to a woman who's racially profiled him as well. He knows that he has to wear a Georgetown t-shirt. It's really complicated though, right? Because Brooks also, or the text, let me make the separation. The narrator also implicates Jess in his the challenges that he faced, warning of the spoiler alerts. One of whom I think is on, who's my aunt, when I said there is an interesting twist at the end. And she said, don't tell me.
Don't tell me, I know. And
So,
I do want to put that warning out. Toward the end of this hour. We will talk about the ending of the book, but I'll give you fair warning so that if you have not read the book yet, and you don't want to know the ending, you have plenty of time to get off. Here's a question from a listener. How does the panel feel about the Thomas Scott character? He's trying to create a name for himself and at the same time has a unique, almost somber view of what he sees and in what he is paid to produce. We should say he is a painter of not quite the highest caliber of that 1850s era, but he does produce a portrait of Lexington, and he does also go off to the Civil War to fight on the Union side. Kentucky is supposed to be neutral, but it turns out it's not so neutral during that war. So, any of you, what did you make of the Scott character?
I mean, what's interesting too is that he's the only one who comes to us in first person, right? And
Yes.
I think when I spoke to Geraldine, she said that she did that because she actually had contemporaneous diaries and letters, where she felt like she could reproduce his voice or the voice of somebody writing from that period of time. And I think it's quite effective in terms of just placing us in the time period, maybe more so even than the scenes that she's reconstructing involving Jarret, because it is so rooted in the way people spoke about their experiences, used language at the time. I liked the notion of a character who was kind of the third rate, like artist, like not the guy who, we would normally, not the famous artist that we've remembered, but the guy who's just was a, this was just a job for them. And kind of seeing this world through their eyes. And I mean, one of the joys for me of this book was just the exposure to these facets of the history that I didn't really know about. Like I didn't actually, and I'm ashamed to say it, but I didn't really know the role that enslaved people played in horse racing of the period. How totally central they were, that they were jockeys, that they were famous trainers, that it was all new to me. So, and I think this is what's one of the things Geraldine tries to do with her books, is to find these kind of interesting angles in history that we might not have ever heard about before, or it's in such great depth. So, but here was another, that there was a job, that had various tiers of capabilities to it, of people who would go around and paint these horses. I found just kind of fascinating for its historical significance.
As for that connection between the enslaved and horse racing, I mean, you've written a book, Katherine, very much on this very subject, which clearly Gal and I had not known of.
Well, I'm curious how good of a job you felt Katherine, that you felt she did, sort of in terms of historical accuracy, like the various sort of levels of responsibility that the people had, if that actually, kind of was true to what we know.
Honestly, I was blown away by how well she balanced the accuracy with not making it seem pedantic and keeping it in the service of the novel. And I thought that was really well done. But that the thing that I thought she was doing I mean, that again, the sort of gradations of privilege discussion that we've been having, which is so completely a huge part of that. And particularly, I think the pressure on families, because the thing that to me really stuck out, because my book goes from, like 1820 to 1920. And the thing that really stuck out to me doing that work is it's not that after enslavement, people in that line of work are less famous. I mean, they're celebrities when they're enslaved and they're celebrities after they're enslaved. What's different after freedom is that it's no longer celebrity or even just, professional competence is no longer something that divides you from your family and your community. It's now something you can share with your family and your community. And I think that's very much depicted here, right? That he's very intent on having a family and being part of a community in a way that is in some ways denied to his father, because his father has to pick, is he going to protect his wife or is he going to protect his son? And in some ways, and I see there's some questions about this in the chat that I think are well taken. How do you make that choice? And historically, Harry Lewis did not make that choice as far as we know, but there were people who did.
Yeah.
And horsemen who did. And this is one of those things where we have no first person account. I don't know how you make that choice, but I would imagine that her vision of Harry Lewis might have thought that Jarret Lewis might have had more of a chance to achieve freedom, and that an enslaved woman would not have access to those same potential avenues to gain that. And so I think this is a guide story.
As a matter of fact, because Jarret's mother has died at a young age, Harry, Jarret's father, purchases his wife's freedom instead of purchasing his son's freedom, because he's lonely, and Jarret is so understanding, at least on the surface. I mean, Dana, what did you think?
The other part I think that, excuse me, we have to consider is the mother would have gone for far less of a price than the young child.
Huh.
On the one hand, he might not have had enough money to buy the son yet. The other thing I think is whether or not he would have had the option. And we know that in the story, at least, once he says, listen, I will buy him, he's told no, in part because at that point, it's clear how good of a groomsman he is for Lexington. So it wasn't as easy for, it turned out not to be a terribly difficult choice for him to make in the end. Like, do I buy this, woman who is my wife to be, or my son? Because he also knows it's going to be virtually impossible because they won't let him go.
Huh. Interesting. The other thing that blew me away was the technical aspect of what Geraldine brought to our understanding regarding horse racing, regarding the moves. I mean, you think about the soil, but you think about the hooves of those horses, how carefully they had to be cared for. You think about the bones. You think about the fact that Jarret was there at Lexington's birth. I mean, Gal, you interviewed Geraldine about this. I was just fascinated with the research she must have done to bring that so alive to each of us.
Yeah, I definitely was left with the impression that she does an immense amount of research to try to understand. And I think Catherine's point is correct in that, like, you can do that. A writer can do that when they're writing historical fiction, and then you just feel that work when you're reading the book. And it's very hard to throw out even the small fascinating details. If there's too many of them, it just weighs down a narrative. So putting that research at the service of a story is really quite interesting. And even her decision. And one of the things I talked about with her, which was I'm kind of curious what the other panelists think, was that when we live in a moment of accusations of cultural appropriation, telling somebody else's story, that she made this decision to both, to tell the story of a Black groomsman during that period of time. And, if she hesitated at all, as she was making that decision. And, I think she really spoke about it as a function of the research, that once she started delving into the story, she realized, just as a storyteller and as somebody who was trying to unearth this particular moment in history, that was really the most interesting way to do it, the most a way to do it that nobody had, maybe that we haven't really read, but a perspective that we haven't really read before. And so that sort of won out over any fears that she might have had about, am I really capable of entering the mind of somebody so different from me? She sort of let that ethic of a fiction writer, that, I should be able to do this. I should let my imagination take me where I want to go. And for me, there were moments where she really managed to do that. There were moments where I felt she was less successful at that, but I'm sort of curious. I'm curious how others.
Dana?
So I think the issue with appropriation, or cultural appropriation in particular, has to do with authenticity, of course, has to do with due diligence, and then has to do with kind of the spirit with which a person approaches this. And this is, to be clear, and I think Jess is an example of this, right? You can have the best intentions and still go terribly wrong. So it's not just about intention, it's about the care, I think, that you give to be able to tell the story. So as you suggest, when she reveals, or when it's revealed to her, when she learns that she has to tell this story of this groomsman who is not talked about, and then she has to reclaim that story about the jockeys, which was like all the thing of lore in Black communities and Black cultures, where people were very clear, the way that the text says, for instance, the minute that it became lucrative and popular, white jockeys began to run the Black jockeys literally off of the track. And this was post-Civil War, when the culture war was, we might have lost the actual Civil War, but we will win the culture war. So I think she is intentional in such a way that it doesn't feel like appropriation, because she's also deliberate in the commentary. So a couple of quick examples. At the first encounter that we talked about a little bit earlier, when Jess essentially profiles Theo, and Theo's response is, she just profiled me, but she's talking about her trauma. The writer who's culturally appropriating doesn't make that recognition and doesn't give that voice to Theo. At the point where we see a couple of other instances, Thomas, for instance, tries to talk Jarret into leaving, or Mary tries to impose herself on Jarret. At those moments when the characters speak for themselves, I think the claim of appropriation falls away just a little bit. And I don't think you can do that without close proximity to people and an understanding of that. And so I think her own biographical reality has a lot to do with it. Her having adopted an immigrant person of color who essentially helped her to understand, and she could view through his lens, what are the implications of my fragility being imposed on you? And we see her pull back from that so many instances. There are at least 4 times in the book where she has the Black character say, my goodness, now I have to take care of you for the way that you've wronged me. Okay.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Yeah.
And a number of people have asked about Mary Barr's relationship with Jarret. Did that ring true to you, Katherine?
Well, I would echo Dana's point in that I think it does ring true, in the sense that I'm sure that young people in that circumstance, definitely might have had that situation where Jarret is often having to tell her, look, I don't want you in my space, A, and B, it's not safe for me for you to be in my space.
And not safe for you either, but
this is not good for anybody.
For
this is a bad idea. What are you doing?
Right.
And you think you're helping me, but you're not. And I'm sure there were people who had that experience. I would say that I think that in terms of sort of barn and stable culture, it would be relatively unusual for a young woman of that social class to be wandering around in those circumstances. Though I would say historically, those families are probably the place where it would be more likely to happen because they were so invested in that industry that it's more likely that women of that family, would have. But I think she's also, of course, playing with Mary Barr as somebody who later historically, gets very interested in ideas about justice and equity. And, she and her sisters are suffragists. And, and of course, caught up in the white supremacy politics of that movement in the South, but, certainly somebody who is very intent on having her own identity.
Well, now we get to that point where I say to members of our listening audience, if you have not read the book, either put your earmuffs on or leave if you do not want to hear the ending of this book. I was I'm not going to say how I felt. I want you to say how you felt. Dana, how did you feel? And talk about what the ending was.
So I'll confess I'm probably the contrarian here. I had two feelings. On the one hand, I thought, well, just to give it a little bit of context, we know that Theo is a runner. He is in a relationship with Jess. He's very conscious of the need to whistle Vivaldi to make white people feel comfortable. So he's going to wear his Georgetown t-shirt, except
Right.
she's still in the Georgetown t-shirt. So he has to put on a raincoat or a black.
And we assume it was black.
Yes, that
And
because
a
it's described
hoodie.
as a black hoodie.
Yeah.
So he's gone to run through Rock Creek Park of all places. To just get some energy off of himself because he's had a bad conversation with his thesis advisor earlier, and he's trying to just adjust to this relationship with Jess. And he stumbles upon a white woman, and this is right after he has told Jess, and Jess has told him how good of a person he is because this woman that he has been profiled by owns this painting. So he's like, I have a buyer for this painting, so I'm going to give it back to her. But maybe you should give it to her because you'll be less threatening as a white woman ringing the doorbell. So all of these foreshadowing moments are there for us, right? He goes through the park, he sees the woman, he stops to help her. The friend Daniel later says, I don't understand how he didn't keep going and call somebody later on, because Daniel, as a Black American, we assume, knows that there are implications.
But his phone was not getting any power. He
Yes.
pulled out his phone. It had no power in Rock Creek Park.
And the next thing you know, he's shot by a policeman and accused of having attacked, probably in anticipation of a rape of this white woman, and that he has a weapon. When of course, part of what he's doing is just raising his hand to say, I can't see because of the light.
He raised his hand with his phone in his hand. That wasn't working.
Yes,
Now,
and to block the light from when the police light is shown on him, the very natural response. And so there's what happens. My sentiment about it, of course, reading it, I was crestfallen. I go, gosh, I mean, and then I think, how did I not see this coming? I'm not that sharp of a reader, And then the other part, and I'm also thinking about the skill, right? To have this happen, especially in real time. Then I thought a little bit about people who would think, well, why do you go and ruin a perfectly good story with this tragedy? And I think it's so important. It had so much verisimilitude to me, really, that something as innocent as a run can end in a death, and why spare the reader? And I had the same attitude that the Black characters had every time they had to explain themselves to white characters who were upset about the way that they felt. My response was, you wanted to be spared of losing this character. He lost his life, even as this kind of fictionalized moment. So in that way, I think she had not just every right as a writer, of course she did, but I thought there in terms of craft, there wasn't a smarter way to end the story, because it punched you in the way that Jarret had been punched, his father had been punched, Theo had been punched, and the attention turns to he lost his life as opposed to how it made me feel.
How about you, Gal? You're muted, Gal. Gal, you're muted. Gal,
Oh no.
you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm back now. I said that now I'm processing Dana's response, which I think is
I'm the contrarian. I know that.
no, it forces me to think about my own sort of, I don't know, I preconceptions about like what a novel should do, right? You know, that I guess I felt my first reaction was maybe the more typical one, I think, of readers, which is, oh wow, it's almost like we've shifted to some other kind of book or some other sort of story, you know, even though I think you're right that it was there all along, these premonitions of what could happen to him, from the very first moment that we meet him, right? And he's and the way that he's assumed to be committing a crime. So I think having just finished it, I think I'm still sort of grappling with it a little bit, and whether or not it completely works for me. I think the one thing that I wanted to say is that, you know, I think throughout the book there's violence, but it's almost a little bit not understated, but it's a little bit sort of off screen, you know, or off stage. And then you get this moment of spectacular, kind of heart-rending violence, you know, that's playing it out right in front of us. And I think that felt to me very intentional too, almost a holding back, and, you know, not just confronting us with the violence, but confronting it with us, you know, right in our backyards right now in 2022. You know, that I think that I think was very much kind of where she was building towards. I think if I have trouble with it, it's fitting a bit of the pieces together, of the different pieces of the book. But the fact that thread of racism and how it plays out in people's lives, and the connection between the 19th century and today, and, you know, all of that really crescendos, I think, in that moment, which is both so familiar to us from the last few years and the constant, you know, news stories, you know, but also one that as a fiction writer, she's taking an enormous risk and just sort of being the one to tell it.
And
too.
she's done it in such a way with Jess having put on his white Georgetown t-shirt. And then he realizes he'll have to put on that black hoodie raincoat. I was blown away. I was so unhappy. I hear you, Dana. I really hear you. And yet I thought, oh, but Theo had such a great life ahead of him. Katherine, what did you think?
Well, I think to pick up on what you just said, Diane, I mean, I think that's kind of Dana's point, right? That when this happens to anyone, you know, that she's driving home the horrible, horrific, violent, destructive waste of it, and how, you know, you should feel punched, because that's the, you know, that's the force of it. But I also think, to sort of riff on what Gal's saying, I mean, to me, it is this very natural crescendo, because she is to some degree trying to write something that speaks about continuities and legacies, and, you know, these sort of I don't know what to call them exactly, but experiences that define the nation because they have touched so many Black Americans' lives, and the degree to which we now understand the police shooting as the definitive example of that in our time. And so in some ways, of course, he has to have that ending to his life, in the same way that you have to put the cotton plantation in the 19th century version of it, that she's trying to tell this, I mean, it really is it's an ambitious thing to try to do, right? You're trying to tell this sort of oblique, sort of odd, untold story and use it to do these huge, ambitious things.
Dana, both Gal and I have confessed that we did not know about this relationship between slavery and horse racing in those early days. Did you?
I did, in part because I think, as I suggested a little bit earlier, it was such a point of pride in the 19th century that the winners of so many early Kentucky derbies had Black jockeys. And Toni Morrison's The Black Book, which I think is in its like 25th edition now, or it certainly is celebrating the 50th anniversary year, has pictures of these jockeys. I think that was probably the first time that I saw it. But there was this big controversy with the NAACP not wanting the jockeys outside of hotels because it suggested subservience. And then there was this pushback from another contingency of Black people who said, no, that's a point of pride for us in Kentucky. It's not offensive. It's not a caricature. It's not a Sambo. It's not an Aunt Jemima or so on. So I had some sense of the history of the ways that Black jockeys had ridden thoroughbreds to victory, probably less sense of how explicit the relationship was between the groomsmen and the horses themselves.
Well, I'm afraid on that note, we are going to have to stop. I have so loved this discussion, and I want to thank you all, Dana Williams, Gal Beckerman, and Katherine Mooney. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Good to meet you both.
Thank you. And if you'd like to hear from Geraldine Brooks herself, she'll be joining me shortly on a separate Zoom link. We'll talk about her inspiration for a horse and a career that has spanned a decade of journalism, as well as 6 novels, including March and Years of Wonder. You still have time to register for that at the link in the chat. Before you go, please take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event that's going to pop up on the screen. And if you would, please consider donating to WAMU. Your financial support is what makes it possible for us to bring you events like this. Go to dianerehm.org/give. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday, September 28th. I'll interview NPR's own Nina Totenberg about her memoir, Dinners with Ruth. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Rashad Young is our engineer. Yanlin Zhang is our events manager. We couldn't do it without support from Lorna Centrella, Verendra Silva, James Coates, Dave Tate, Jerry Washington, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thank you to all these people and to all of you. I hope to see you next month. Have a great day. Bye-bye.